Thomas Aldridge built an empire. Elise Aldridge planned to steal it. Peter Aldridge was framed to take the fall. And Maria, the quiet housekeeper, saw it all unfold until the lies turned deadly. This is the chilling story of how a wealthy businessman fell victim to his wife's darkest betrayal, and how the truth clawed its way to the surface before it was buried forever. Thomas Aldridge had it all. To the outside world, he was the perfect example of success, a self-made millionaire who had built a real estate empire from scratch. With sharp instincts and a commanding presence, Thomas climbed the ladder of wealth faster than anyone expected. He owned luxury cars, traveled the world on private jets, and lived in a grand mansion nestled in a quiet suburban neighborhood just outside the city. His life was admired, even envied, but no one knew what lay beneath the polished surface. 10 years earlier, at a black-tie charity gala, Thomas met Elise. She was graceful, magnetic, and beautiful. Her charm caught his attention, and within 6 months, they were married. Elise adapted quickly to her new life. She filled their home with art and elegance, hosted high-profile guests, and managed charity events under Thomas's name. She was the perfect partner, or so it seemed. Behind her poised smile and loving gestures, Elise carried a hunger for control. She had grown up poor and resented it. Marriage to Thomas was her escape, but it wasn't the finish line. She wanted more than comfort. She wanted ownership. Also living in the Aldridge household was Peter, Thomas's younger brother. He had joined the business after a rough patch in his 20s. Though not as ambitious as Thomas, Peter was trustworthy and loyal. He oversaw the company's financial operations and lived in the guest wing of the mansion. He saw Thomas as a mentor and was grateful for the second chance. But he also trusted Elise, a mistake that would cost him more than he knew. Then there was Maria, the quiet housekeeper. She had worked for the Aldridges for nearly 7 years. Never drawing attention, Maria kept to her routine, cleaning, organizing, and watching everything. She noticed details others ignored. From the schedule of deliveries to whispers behind closed doors, she knew the rhythms of the household better than anyone. And over time, she started sensing changes, small at first, but troubling. The tension began to rise when Thomas discovered discrepancies in company finances. A few $100s here, a misfiled receipt there. He didn't think much of it at first, but patterns began to form. Thomas, always cautious, kept the matter quiet. He didn't want to draw public attention, so he turned inward, focusing on the people closest to him. Suspicion landed on Peter. He was the only one with regular access to the financial system, and his recent behavior, missed meetings, late reports, raised concerns. Thomas confronted his brother in private. Peter was stunned, stammered through explanations, and denied any wrongdoing. But Thomas's tone was cold, and his trust had started to crack. Elise, meanwhile, played both sides. She comforted Peter, saying Thomas was under stress and would come around. She reassured Thomas that Peter probably made an honest mistake. But all the while, she was the one behind the missing money. Unbeknownst to both brothers, Elise had created fake invoices and transferred small amounts of money into accounts she controlled under different names. She was clever, careful, and always one step ahead. By using Peter's login credentials, information she obtained with ease, she made it look like he was the one responsible. And when Thomas started digging deeper, she encouraged him to continue, knowing where his search would lead. Maria noticed the increasing silence during family dinners, the abrupt arguments behind doors, the way Peter avoided eye contact. She started keeping mental notes. One evening, she overheard Elise speaking on the phone in a hushed voice. The words were vague, but the tone was sharp, urgent, dangerous. Maria didn't say anything, but the seed of doubt had taken root. One morning, Thomas found a folded envelope placed on the seat of his car. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The letter was typed and unsigned. It warned him that someone inside his home was working against him. No names, no evidence, just a cryptic message and a reminder to be careful. Thomas didn't show the letter to anyone. But that day, he changed everything. He installed hidden cameras in the home office and began recording phone calls. He started asking quiet questions, checking files himself instead of sending assistants. The more he looked, the less he trusted what he saw. Elise noticed the shift. He had become distant, more private. But she didn't panic. She had prepared for this. What she didn't expect was how quickly Thomas would unravel the trail she had tried so hard to hide. As suspicion thickened and trust thinned, the family's perfect life began to fall apart, quietly but irreversibly. And none of them knew just how far the betrayal had already gone that Thomas's world was beginning to twist in on itself. Every day brought a new reason to doubt the people closest to him. His once peaceful home felt like a cage of secrets, and the letter in his car haunted his thoughts. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching his every move, not just out of concern, but calculation. He reviewed footage from the hidden cameras he'd placed around the house. Most showed nothing but ordinary movement. But one night, around 2:40 a.m., Elise appeared in his office. She moved confidently, not searching, but checking. She typed briefly on his laptop, opened a drawer, then walked out. The footage was too blurry to see what she took, if anything. But to Thomas, the message was clear. Elise had something to hide that he didn't confront her. Instead, he hired a private investigator, someone with a background in financial fraud and cybercrime. Within days, the investigator discovered something Thomas had never considered. Years ago, Elise had convinced him to start a charitable foundation in her name. It had seemed harmless, even noble. Thomas signed the papers without question, trusting her. But the charity was a shell, used to move money out of the company's books into untraceable accounts. Elise had funneled hundreds of thousands of dollars through it, buying property under aliases, making international transfers, and living a life Thomas didn't know existed. The investigator kept digging and soon found something even more disturbing. Elise had made multiple visits to a discreet legal advisor, a man named David Langston, who had once been disbarred for unethical practices. Langston specialized in helping people hide assets, dissolve partnerships quietly, and, when necessary, forge documents. Elise had been preparing for more than just theft. She had been planning an exit, one that would leave Thomas empty-handed, disgraced, and possibly even jailed for crimes he didn't commit. Meanwhile, Peter was coming undone. Ever since Thomas had accused him, he'd become withdrawn, barely leaving his room. He had taken a leave of absence from work and spent most of his time drinking or pacing the grounds in silence. Elise acted like a supportive sister-in-law. She brought him meals, offered comforting words, and assured him it would all blow over. But behind her kindness was manipulation. She wanted Peter to unravel completely, to look guilty, to keep Thomas focused on the wrong suspect. She knew exactly how much guilt Peter carried, not for fraud, but for failing his brother's trust. Maria, still quietly observing, noticed the way Elise hovered around Peter, the way she always arrived before anyone else could, the way Peter seemed more broken. After every encounter, Maria didn't say anything, not yet, but she had begun recording details in a small journal she kept hidden beneath her mattress. Then came the night Thomas collapsed. He had been alone in his office, reviewing documents, when he felt dizzy and short of breath. He tried calling for help but blacked out before he could dial. Hours later, a neighbor who had stopped by for a late meeting found him unconscious and called for an ambulance. Doctors said it was a heart attack, most likely stress-induced. He survived, but just barely. He was moved to a private hospital where he remained under observation. With Thomas incapacitated, Elise stepped forward as the public face of the family. She took over company meetings, answered media inquiries, and presented herself as the loving, overwhelmed wife trying to keep her husband's empire from falling apart. Most believed her. She had always been poised, articulate, and compassionate. But behind the scenes, she was accelerating her plan. She began liquidating assets, authorizing transfers, and rewriting legal documents. She told the board Thomas had requested her to act as his proxy. With a forged power of attorney, prepared weeks earlier by Langston, she now had complete control. Within a few days, she moved over $2 million into separate accounts and began the process of selling off Thomas's personal holdings. Peter was too unstable to stop her. Still grappling with the belief that he had somehow destroyed everything, he locked himself away and avoided contact. Elise saw his silence as permission to proceed, but Elise had made one misstep. She assumed Maria had left quietly when she dismissed her earlier that week, accusing her of theft. What she didn't know was that Maria had taken copies of notes, photos, and small bits of evidence she had gathered over the past months. And she wasn't done yet. Maria had already made contact with the private investigator. And soon, Elise would learn that not everyone in the house had been blind to her lies. The betrayal was deeper than anyone imagined, and the storm was only just beginning. Maria's instincts had been right all along. From the moment she was forced out of the Aldrich home, she knew Elise was orchestrating something far more sinister than simple theft. What Elise didn't know was that Maria had quietly duplicated her notes, saved a copy of the footage showing Elise sneaking into Thomas's office, and managed to pass them to the one person still working in the shadows, Thomas's private investigator, Greg Fallon. Fallon was already suspicious of Elise, but Maria's evidence solidified what he had started to piece together. With her notes in hand, he expanded his investigation beyond company records. One particular lead caught his attention: Elise's repeated interactions with David Langston, a former lawyer with a long list of buried controversies. Though disbarred, Langston still operated quietly in the background, offering legal guidance to those wanting to bend the rules without breaking them, at least not in ways that could be proven easily. What Fallon uncovered next was chilling. Elise and Langston weren't just transferring funds and dissolving business assets. They were planning a full erasure of Thomas's financial and legal identity. Fake documents had already been created showing that Thomas had willingly signed over power of attorney and had appointed Elise sole executor of all personal and business decisions. Several properties had already been moved into a private trust owned by a fake entity in the Cayman Islands. More disturbing was a recorded conversation Fallon unearthed between Elise and Langston. In it, Elise hinted that Thomas's condition might not last long, and that finalizing the paperwork before anything unexpected happened was essential. Meanwhile, Thomas remained in recovery. Doctors noted minor inconsistencies in his medical results. While it was indeed a heart attack, something had triggered it, an unusual reaction to a sedative present in his system. It hadn't been prescribed by any of his doctors. When questioned, Elise claimed Thomas had taken it for anxiety, but medical records showed no such history. Quietly, hospital staff flagged the concern and passed it along to Fallon through a mutual contact. Back at the mansion, Elise continued with her plan. She had moved into Thomas's study and was purging files, burning some and shredding others. She instructed staff to clear out anything irrelevant. Peter remained in the guest wing, disconnected and numb. Elise had successfully isolated him from the world. She supplied him with alcohol, reassured him that everything would be fine, and told him Thomas had stopped asking about him. With his confidence shattered and no one else to speak to, Peter fell deeper into despair. Fallon decided it was time to act. Using the information Maria had given him, he approached Thomas's longtime attorney, Vincent Blake. Unlike Langston, Blake had built a reputation on discretion and loyalty. Once shown the forged legal documents and fraudulent asset transfers, Blake moved quickly. He filed for a temporary injunction to freeze all transactions linked to Thomas's name. Within 48 hours, a judge approved it. Elise's plans came to a screeching halt. The court's decision prevented any further transfers. It also prompted an audit of Elise's recent activities. Fallon delivered a report to law enforcement, and though the wheels turned slowly, a case was beginning to form. Elise, for the first time, started to panic. She contacted Langston, urging him to accelerate their exit plan. They discussed fleeing to South America using new identities, but time was no longer on their side. Langston warned her that Thomas's recovery would ruin everything. Elise suggested they may still have one option left, ensuring Thomas never returned home. The implication was clear. Fallon, monitoring her phone calls through discreet surveillance, had enough to escalate the matter. Peter, slowly emerging from the fog Elise had trapped him in, found a folder left outside his door. Inside were copies of financial statements, screenshots of suspicious transactions, and a brief note. "She set you up. They're watching. Speak now, or lose everything." Fallon had left it there, knowing Peter still had a conscience, even if he had lost his way. The documents rattled him. For the first time, he began to see Elise not as a savior during crisis, but as the architect of his downfall. Peter reached out to Blake and offered to give a statement. He revealed how Elise had manipulated his access to the company's accounts, how she used his trust to frame him, and how she fed him misinformation about Thomas's recovery. His testimony would later become a turning point in the investigation. Shortly after, Elise was served with a warrant and arrested while attempting to leave the country. Authorities found thousands in cash, multiple passports, and forged legal documents in her travel bag. Langston vanished the same night, but was apprehended days later at a small airport in Mexico, using an alias. The public soon learned what had happened behind the walls of the Aldridge estate. The perfect wife, the perfect marriage, the perfect life, all a mask. What had started as financial fraud had spiraled into something far darker. A calculated plan to erase a man's life, frame his brother, and inherit a fortune built on betrayal. The truth was finally out, but the damage left in Elise's wake had only just begun to reveal itself. The courtroom buzzed with tension from the moment the trial began. Elise Aldridge, once the elegant face of the Aldridge family, now sat in silence behind the defense table. Gone were the designer outfits, the polished grace, and the mask of charm she wore so effortlessly. In their place stood a woman surrounded by hard evidence, under the scrutiny of a courtroom packed with media, former colleagues, and members of the public drawn in by the scandal. The charges against her were extensive: fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy, and attempted murder. The prosecution built their case methodically. They laid out a timeline showing Elise's financial deception that spanned nearly 6 years. Using forged documents, fake charities, and fraudulent accounts, she had siphoned millions from her husband's empire. Bank statements were shown on large screens, matching entries from the company's internal systems to Elise's shadow accounts. Her scheme had been quiet but effective, designed to slowly bleed Thomas's assets without immediate detection. Peter was called to the stand early in the trial. Once fragile and ashamed, he now stood with a new steadiness. He admitted to his own failures, how he neglected his responsibilities and fell into Elise's web. He recounted how she exploited his vulnerability after Thomas's accusation, how she isolated him and fed him lies, all while using his access to carry out her theft. His voice cracked only once, when he recalled the moment he realized his brother had nearly died because of what she had done. Maria's testimony followed. She sat calmly and answered each question with precision. Her journal, filled with dates, times, and descriptions of events, became one of the strongest pieces of evidence. She described Elise's late-night movements, her phone calls, and the way she dismissed staff who got too close. Her account painted a clear picture of manipulation and cold calculation. The jury listened intently, some visibly shaken by her calm recollection of Elise's cruelty. The most damning evidence came from Greg Fallon, the private investigator. His surveillance recordings included audio of Elise and Langston discussing how long Thomas would remain out of the picture and whether a second dose might be necessary. The prosecution presented toxicology reports confirming traces of an unprescribed sedative in Thomas's system, one that had dangerously interacted with his heart medication, triggering the cardiac episode. Fallon's report detailed Elise's meetings with Langston, the shell companies, and the attempted asset transfers. It was a web of lies so intricately woven that even Thomas, a man known for his attention to detail, had been caught off guard. Langston, in exchange for a reduced sentence, testified against Elise. He confirmed everything: the fake signatures, the creation of the offshore trusts, and even the conversation where Elise suggested ensuring Thomas never recovers. His demeanor was cold, unapologetic, but consistent. His words removed any final doubt about Elise's intentions. She hadn't just wanted to steal from Thomas. She wanted him gone. Throughout the trial, Elise remained mostly silent. Occasionally, she whispered to her lawyer or adjusted a note in front of her, but she showed no signs of remorse. Her defense strategy had been built on denial, but the evidence was overwhelming. Every lie unraveled in court, every plan exposed. Even her public image crumbled. Videos of her speaking at charity galas played side by side with evidence of the same charities being used to funnel stolen money. The verdict came after 3 days of jury deliberation. Guilty on all counts. The sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom fell quiet as the judge read the final words. Elise didn't react. She simply stared ahead, her hands folded neatly in front of her, like she had accepted the inevitable long before the trial had even begun. Outside the courtroom, reporters swarmed for statements. Peter declined interviews, choosing instead to walk away quietly with Thomas's attorney. Maria returned to her small home on the edge of town, refusing all media offers. Fallon moved on to another case, already fading into the background. As he always did. As for Thomas, he watched the trial remotely. He was still recovering, both physically and emotionally. The betrayal had aged him, dulled his energy, but not his mind. He saw clearly now what had been happening behind the scenes. What shocked him most wasn't the theft, but how close he came to being erased. Not just financially, but completely. The trial marked the end of Elise's long deception. Her empire of lies had collapsed under its own weight. But the ripples of her betrayal continued to spread, leaving behind broken trust, haunted memories, and a family forever changed. The dust had settled, but the silence that followed was heavier than the chaos that came before. After the verdict, Thomas Aldridge chose not to return to his old life. The mansion, once the pride of his success, now stood as a monument to his deepest humiliation. He sold the property quietly, without ceremony. He didn't want reminders. The art Elise had selected, the furniture she arranged, the photographs she insisted they frame. Every corner whispered her name. It was no longer a home, only a stage where betrayal had been carefully rehearsed and perfectly performed. Thomas left the country not long after the sentencing. He purchased a modest villa on the coast of Portugal under a different name. The weather was mild, the people were kind, and, most importantly, no one knew who he was. He spent his days walking through quiet streets, reading, and writing in a notebook he never let out of sight. Some believed he was working on a memoir. Others said he was simply trying to make sense of the life he once lived. He spoke to no journalists. He didn't grant interviews. For a man who had once been at the center of attention, he had vanished completely by choice. Back home, Peter remained. He took over what was left of the business. The Aldridge name had taken a hit, but the company survived. Investors who once abandoned the sinking ship returned cautiously, reassured by Peter's transparent leadership and commitment to rebuilding. He worked long hours, slowly undoing the financial knots Elise had tied. Every day was a battle to restore what had been lost, but with each passing month, the business regained its footing. He never tried to reclaim the family name's prestige. He simply focused on doing what Thomas would have done: lead with purpose, not pride. Peter also made it a point to visit Thomas once a year. Their conversations were brief, but meaningful. There were no apologies left to give, only quiet understanding. Between two men who had survived the same storm. They didn't talk about Elise. Her name had become a ghost neither of them wanted to summon. Instead, they spoke about business, health, books they were reading. Slowly, their bond mended not with grand gestures, but in silence and shared survival. Maria never returned to domestic work. After the trial, she disappeared from the public eye. For a while, no one knew where she had gone. Then a small publishing website released a document under the title The Quiet Witness. It was a series of journal entries written in simple, careful language, exactly like Maria had kept them. The document spread quietly, gaining attention for its raw honesty. It wasn't sensationalized or dramatic. It simply detailed what she had seen, what she had heard, and what she had done when no one else would. Experts in criminal psychology praised the journal as a powerful case study in silent observation and courage. Maria was offered consulting jobs, book deals, and appearances, but she turned them all down. Her job had been to protect. That job was done. She moved to a small town up north and lived in peace, still listening, still watching, but this time for herself. Elise, now inmate 43017 in a federal correctional facility, remained unrepentant. She kept to herself, rarely speaking, always writing. Staff reported she spent hours filling notebooks, though no one knew what she wrote. Some believed she was planning an appeal. Others said she was simply documenting her life the same way she had once documented her lies, meticulously, obsessively. Her story, which once graced society pages and fashion blogs, was now a cautionary tale whispered in hushed tones. From boardrooms to university ethics lectures, her name became a symbol of how charm can mask calculation and how love, if weaponized, can destroy more than trust. It can ruin lives. The mansion was eventually bought by a foreign investor and remodeled. Beyond recognition, the neighbors, once intrigued by the flashing lights and camera crews, returned to their routines. Yet, now and then, whispers resurfaced. They spoke of the woman who almost got away with it all, the businessman who vanished, and the house that no one wanted to keep for long. Something about its walls held on to too much. Years passed, but the story never truly faded. It lived on in documents, court records, whispered rumors, and the quiet decisions of those who survived it. Thomas, Peter, and Maria moved forward, not to forget, but to live beyond what had been taken. In the end, Elise's darkest betrayal hadn't destroyed them. It had only revealed the truth about what they were strong enough to endure.